also knew that she was clever, and that her animated conversation, high energy, and cheerful disposition could bring a smile of pleasure to the faces of the adults about her, just as her impertinent question had made King Frederick William laugh. She was a princess of the insignificant but honourable Principality of Anhalt-Zerbst, one of the 300 or so independent political entities where German was spoken. In the year of her encounter with the Prussian king, 1733, these 300 scattered principalities, free cities, bishoprics, and dukedoms were bound only by the loosest of political ties, a vague and largely ceremonial union under the greatly decayed authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. Much more real than the Emperor's shadowy aegis was the power of the King of Prussia, who had at his command one of the largest and most highly disciplined armies in Europe, and whose territorial ambitions threatened the integrity of the smaller states that bordered his kingdom. Anhalt-Zerbst was among these states, a few hundred square miles of pine forests, pasture land, and bog, nestled between the electorate of Saxony on the south, the Archbishopric of Magdeburg on the west, and Prussia on the north. Since the early 13th century, Anhalt had been proudly independent, but over the centuries its princely dynasty had branched out in so many directions that all its princes were impoverished, the tiny state lacking the resources to support a populous ruling house. For several generations, the Anhalt princes had avoided destitution by serving in the army of the Prussian king, and Sophie's father, Prince Christian August, had followed this tradition, leading troops into battle against the French and the Swedes, devoting his young manhood to the advancement of Prussian arms, though he had neither the talent nor the inclination to distinguish himself as a leader of men. At the advanced age of 37, Christian August had married a relatively poor but well-born princess, Johanna of Holstein-Gottorp, and had taken her to live in the bleak garrison town of Stettin on the Pomeranian border, where he and his regiment were stationed. Johanna was only 16, a pretty, shallow girl, accustomed to being spoiled by her grandmother, the Duchess, and dismayed by the sparse social life of Stettin, where the leaders of society were grimly correct provincial military officers and tedious tradesmen's wives. Johanna and Christian August rented a house from a local businessman, settled in, and soon Johanna was pregnant. This at least gave her hope. If she had a son, he might inherit the Principality of Anhalt-Zerbst, for the current ruler, a cousin of Christian August, was childless, and likely to remain so, and Christian August's older brother Ludwig was unmarried. The birth of a son would liberate Johanna from Stettin, and might liberate her husband from having to live in thrall to the Prussian king. But the child was a girl, Sophie, and in giving birth to her, Johanna suffered terribly. Her labour nearly killed her, and for 5 months she barely clung to life, in pain, and no doubt resenting the disappointing child whose arrival had brought her to death's door. Sophie was put into the care of a 19-year-old wet nurse. Then, when she was weaned, she was turned over to a governess, Madeleine Cardell, who did her best to curb the little girl's overactive energies, and try to turn her into a quiet and docile child, at least for as long as she and her rather fawning governess were within her parents' view. Johanna, once she recovered, was soon pregnant again, and this time she was determined to have a son. When Sophie was 18 months old, her brother Wilhelm was born, and immediately he became the centre of Johanna's world. Sophie was cast into the shade and neglected, while the new baby received all his parents' attention. All the more so, as it became apparent that one of his legs was weak and shriveled, making it impossible for him to develop normally. Doctors were consulted, folk remedies tried. The boy was prayed over, taken to bathe in mineral springs, and subjected to every kind of therapy. But little Wilhelm didn't thrive.